So, whoops. A reader of Henry Dreyfuss's Symbol Sourcebook, released 50 years ago in 1972, would have noted a description of the work on the inner jacket flap, calling it the realization of a 20-year dream for the famed industrial designer. For these many years, he and his staff have been collecting and codifying graphic symbols as they are used in all walks of life throughout the world. And now, at the summit of his career, he has compiled them in his, quote, dictionary of symbols. I'm curious about these scare quotes around dictionary, whether they were Dreyfuss's or put there at the insistence of maybe a McGraw-Hill staffer. But nonetheless, in the first pages of his introduction, Dreyfuss himself rejects it. Quote, "It is titled as Sourcebook to explain that it is not a dictionary, which would imply completeness," end quote. So here he points not only to the impossibility of a complete dictionary of symbols, but also points to the larger data bank of some 20,000 symbols compiled over the preceding years, from which the 1,000 or so symbols included in the book are drawn. It will, he writes, nonetheless, quote, "serve to show the reader what is," which is a first step, and will be a guide to future evaluations of what should be in the world of standardized, universally understandable graphic symbols, end quote. At the same time, his introduction also affirmed his belief that a system of symbols might be one day compiled that would be equally recognizable anywhere in the world, realizing, quote, "the dream of a universal basic means of communication," end quote. So in my talk today, I want to take up some of these ideas through another sentence buried at the back of the Symbol Sourcebook and its acknowledgement pages. It is here that Dreyfuss gives special thanks to, quote, Dr. Margaret Mead and Rudolph Modely of GLYPHS, Inc., who have worked with us throughout this project, and it was Dr. Mead who gave us the inspiration for the graphic forms section. So what was GLYPHS, Inc.? What was its realization to this source book that we've all come together to discuss? In giving a partial answer to this question, I'm also going to be surveying the broader landscape of pictographic experiment and promotion throughout the 1960s and early 1970s at a lively and at times fractious moment of historical enthusiasm for the social, educational, and commercial potential of universal visual signs and symbols, and one in which both Dreyfuss and GLYPHS, Inc. played key roles. So I actually want to start here with this letter in the Dreyfuss archive from Henry Dreyfuss to Rudolph Modely in June 1969 at his home in Kent, Connecticut. Dear Rudy, thank you for your paper on universally usable graphic symbols. All that you say is true. We are continuing to collect and file symbols at our usual pace. A great many things come in every day. We will have to get together one day when I am in the East or you are on the West Coast. Kind regards, HD. So this is just going to frame the sense of their interactions, which would go back actually to the mid-1950s, if not earlier. So Modely, as we've heard, was an Austrian-American designer and industry consultant and author who had worked with Otto Neurath at the Museum of Science and Industry, the Museum of Society and Economy in Vienna in the 1920s before emigrating to the US in 1930. And GLYPHS was the brainchild, GLYPHS Inc. was the brainchild of both Modely and Margaret Mead, the American cultural anthropologist best known for her 1928 work, Coming of Age in Samoa. But by the early 1960s, she was one of the best known public intellectuals in the US. So when Modely comes to America in the 1930s, he first works at the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago briefly, fulfills a government role, has a potential role as a sort of US agent for isotype institutes abroad. But then in 1934, originates his first business, Pictorial Statistics Incorporated. And in 1942 puts out this pictorial symbols, 1,000 pictorial symbols, by the now named Pictographic Corporation. And in the 30s and 40s has these little telefax charts, which are appearing in magazines and newspapers throughout the United States. And I know that at least Jason is familiar with these because I lifted these images directly from his recent article about Telefact.
Yeah, I wonder if that was my picture in the middle.
Yeah, is that your copy of Pictorial Symbols?
No, it's from the New York Public Library. Anyways.
Okay, yeah, but it is your image for sure. So thank you. Unacknowledged lifting there. So by the late 1950s and early 1960s, though, and this is the period I want to talk about, Modely had embarked on a new phase of work. He had been doing work, as always, for industry and government publications and also private clients. Here's his illustrations, his graphics for the book USA in New Dimensions from the 20th Century Fund in 1957. But it's around this time that he starts essentially a new phase of his career, and it's this one that brought him into conjunction with both Mead and Dreyfuss. So in April 1959, Modely addressed the Art Directors Club of New York at their 4th annual communications conference with a talk entitled The Challenge of Symbology. So speaking directly to his audience, Modely tells them, about a year ago, the Fund for the Advancement of Education of the Ford Foundation asked me to make an exploratory survey to find out if they should make a broader study of the role of graphic symbols in communications. You will be interested to know that the idea for this project came from a designer. It was Henry Dreyfuss, who suggested the idea originally and who has maintained a constant interest in it, end quote. So as he goes on to describe his process in approaching this study, Modely says, what struck me first was the multitude of separate efforts, and we're going to hear this over and over again, the multitude of separate efforts in the field of graphic symbols. There are many symbols brought to us by tradition. There are many of you creating new graphic symbols every day. There are books which show symbols, books on the history of symbols, and books that deal with some aspect of their creation and reception. But there is no coherent effort which puts together all we know and all we don't know. What we must do, he says, is to bring some order into what we have. We need to collect what there is, look at it, classify it, and catalog it. This doesn't sound like a very exciting job, but it may well be one. The result could be the creation of a dictionary of graphic symbols, a collection of all graphic symbols used in our culture, organized by meaning, by shape, by area of use, etc., etc. It would be a reference source to which all who use symbols could go to find out what others have done and thought. So clear, jumping forward to 13 years later, the Symbol Sourcebook, and after that, Modely's own handbook of pictorial symbols. So I want to note that for Modely at this point, the project of a dictionary of symbols is already a jumping off point from which to develop what he calls the general laws that symbols follow. We need to develop working hypotheses and test them to see if they really work. If we can do so, he says, we have not only found a way of more direct impact, we may have found a way to overcome the language barrier. So echoes of Sue's talk earlier. So already in 1959, we have the kernel of a project that would occupy both Dreyfuss and Modely in conjunction with Mead and others over the next dozen years and more. Modely and Dreyfuss had met some years earlier. I know that they met in April 1956. I don't know if they had connections before that. But in 1956, they made plans together to draft a proposal for a comprehensive study focusing on the role of symbols and signs in modern life. Lee Davis, in a recent article, notes that Modely met with Alvin C. Urich at the Fund for the Advancement of Education in New York, at which point Urich suggested this proposal be simplified, a sort of preparatory study to lead into a potential larger survey. So Modely submitted this proposal in 1956 and followed it with a letter to Urich in which he wrote, I wholeheartedly agree with Henry Dreyfuss that our eventual goal should be a dictionary of symbols. As I mentioned to you, Harold Laswell of Yale and I submitted a project with exactly that title to the Carnegie Corporation almost 20 years ago. If we are successful, such a dictionary would be the climax of our work. So despite Urich's efforts within the Ford Foundation, the project met with general skepticism. The Ford Foundation Vice President Don Price met with Modely in March 1957, after which he observed this difference. Well, Mr. Dreyfuss, as an industrial designer, is primarily interested in a study which will point toward the possible standardization of symbols for commercial use, for example, in the international transportation and communication business. Mr. Moodley believes that a study should start out as a quite basic job of research covering the whole field, religious symbols, scholarly symbols, map symbols, etc., and the question of possible utility should not be prejudged. He follows up with this by saying, I do not believe that there is clear enough evidence that this could come to anything. I will tell Mr. Moodley we cannot help him. So the broader scope of Moodley's ambition was not in his favor at the Ford Foundation. However, in early 1958, UREC did manage to secure $25,000 in funding for the preliminary study for Moodley to undertake this. And is this which he talks about in his talk, The Challenge of Symbology? As part of this, Moodley prepared, as I think Sue mentioned, a second proposal for the larger expanded study of symbols, which was not funded despite his own writing of the proposal and writing to UREC, and also Henry Dreyfuss's own personal letters of support for the project to UREC in 1960. And there's an interesting line here from Dreyfuss to UREC where he says, the more our world shrinks, the greater becomes the necessity for simple communication in educational, scientific, and industrial areas. Perhaps our first exchange of thoughts with the man on another planet will be through symbols. Why not? And I'm reminded here, of course, of the plaque that was attached to the Pioneer 10 spacecraft, along with the golden record, launched just a few months after the Symbol Sourcebook appears in print. So Moodley's work at the Ford Foundation ends in 1960 with the unsuccessful second proposal. But by early 1961, he's writing enthusiastically to UREC about a new nonprofit organization that he is starting called Symbol Research Incorporated. And he plans to publish a small magazine called Symbols. So nothing ever really came of this, but it sowed the seeds for what will become GLYPHS. Okay, so 2 years later, a document included in the Dreyfuss archive shows Moodley applying for funding to the Center for Research in Communications at Colorado State University for a feasibility study for the creation of a dictionary of symbols and the development of a universal symbolic language. So this new last ambition introduces an idealistic, even utopian element that was absent from the earlier proposal, and one that would come to define much work in graphic symbols in this period. So in 1962 here, he writes, the need for a universal, easy-to-learn symbolic language in our interdependent world has become increasingly apparent. Many newly independent nations seek to understand us as we seek to understand them. So there is this sort of nod to the kind of decolonial, post-colonial project of the 1960s, even if it's still phrased in this sort of us and them. We want to understand them, and they want to understand us. This lack of commonly understandable verbal means of communication points directly to the need for development of a visual language as an instrument of global understanding. So again, this was unsuccessful, kind of came to nothing. But in 1964, these ambitions met with the proposal as part of the International Cooperation Year 1965. As Sue has already noted, this is the United Nations Circular AAC 118L5, released in March 1964, where as part of this broad International Cooperation Year to take place in 1965, it has been suggested to the committee that one of the useful tasks which could be encouraged during this year would be the development of a kind of symbol, known technically as a glyph. And again, they repeat this kind of language that we see elsewhere in this period. With the great increase in international contact and the development of new forms of communication, it would be advantageous to have more symbols which are independent of language. Now, I'm not sure that many of the people I'm talking about would agree with more. In fact, more might have been the problem, but certainly they were looking for better and more standardized forms. So nonetheless, when they say it has been suggested to the committee, the person who suggested it was Margaret Mead. I'm still tracing the sort of history of that suggestion, how it came to be about, but Mead had made this suggestion leading to the sort of committee on glyphs, and from mid-1965 on, Mead and Moodley seem to have joined forces to promote the possibilities of universal graphic symbols. So in a progress report to himself, it seems, in June 1965, Moodley includes a note on cooperation with the United Nations, where he writes, Margaret Mead has suggested that individual countries could take on the problem of safety for traveler and the stranger for the establishment of a series of universal glyphs. An interim North American Committee on Glyphs is being formed. Larry Frank is chairman, Margaret Mead vice chairman, and Rudolph Moodley executive director. At some point this year or early in the next, this North American Committee on Glyphs would become GLYPHS Incorporated with the same board of directors. So as early as the fall of 1965, Mead had promoted the idea of a universal visual language in print in her article, The Future as the Basis for Establishing a Shared Culture. And she starts here with the familiar premise of the 1960s of a disjunctive world, the progressive fragmentation of what was once a whole. Higher education has broken down into a mass of separate specialties, and the news media bring sort of proliferating noise of contradictory worldviews. Wherever we turn, she wrote, we find piecemeal statements and definitions, and piecemeal attempts at solution that lead to more, not fewer, difficulties. We are becoming acutely aware that we need to build a culture within which there is better communication. A culture within which specialists can talk with specialists, specialists can talk with laymen, laymen can ask questions of specialists, and the least educated can participate. So in the absence of a shared single culture or worldview, knowledge, she says, has to be transmitted using a shared means of communication. Quote, using every graphic device available to us and relying more on models than on words. In recent years, there have been extensive discussion of the need for a systematic development of what are now called glyphs. What is needed internationally is a set of glyphs which does not refer to any single phonological system or to any specific cultural system, but will indeed form a system of visual signs with universally recognized reference. And she says that to this point there has been no sustained effort to explore the minimum number of glyphs or to make a selection of glyphs that could be used for this purpose. So just to go back here, the one on the right, the yellow, it's around this time Doris Marks reports that, quote, Rudolph Moodley is now involved in something called Symbols Incorporated for Intercultural Communication. Maybe they realized it spelled out sick, I don't know, but Margaret Mead is involved and they would like Henry Dreyfuss's participation on whatever basis he wishes. It notes that Moodley and Mead are, quote, planning a major exhibition in New York in the fall of 1966, which will be international in scope. And so this again is sort of what would become glyphs, what would become named glyphs by the fall of 1966 when they released their first newsletter, and this is the one that appears in the Dreyfuss archives with some marginal notes from Dreyfuss. So here they talk about this exhibition as the main focus of their work at that point. Glyphs for World Communication. This is the idea of this exhibition to be held in 1967 in New York, and they invite submissions of design proposals, presumably to be included in the final exhibition, for consideration by an international jury that includes Paul Rand, Katsumi Masaru, Willie DeMaio, Mildred Constantine from the MoMA, and many others. And so here we have their sort of call for submissions and then the full list of the jurors. And here are just some of the submissions they received for various items listed on the submission form. Here are just a few of the pages depicting toilet signs, some kind of distressingly literal, others confusingly abstract. Some for information, entrance, exit, do not enter, no smoking, poison, and fire alarm. By the time the second and, to my understanding, final issue of the Glyphs newsletter came out, some 2 years after the first issue, it announced the indefinite postponement of the exhibition due to lack of funds. They had received space and an initial grant of $10,000 from Time Incorporated, but no further funding seems to have been forthcoming. And they estimated the total cost of the exhibition at $80,000, and they ended up with 10. So they postponed it indefinitely. It would never take place. But as for the juried competition, they treated the results somewhat delicately. They noted that, quote, "Our panel of experts, after review of the submissions, felt that publication of the designs at this time would not contribute to the furtherance of universal graphic symbols. In fact, the proposals proved that extensive preparatory study by experts in many disciplines must be undertaken before design work on glyph candidates can be fruitfully started." So they weren't overly impressed by what they saw, but it showed them the need for research actually to precede design work. But in other pages of the newsletter, they lived up to their claim to be a kind of clearinghouse for information and developments in symbol design. So they highlighted work from a range of designers in different countries, including the Canadian designer Paul Arthur's pictographs from Expo 67 in Montreal of the previous year. And Arthur was another figure in the pictographic scene of these years who Modely seems to have met in 1965 when Arthur and Martin Krampen approached Modely in a kind of consultative role about potential pictograph designs for Expo 67. So Modely and Arthur became friends, and they worked together occasionally through the next decade, including in 1967 on a proposal to the US Department of Transportation for a set of universal graphics to be used in national transportation signage, which would eventually sort of be realized as the DOT symbol sign system later in the 1970s. Here we see the pictographics designed by Paul Arthur and Associates for the Expo 67 fair in Montreal, and some of the signage, the original paste ups for the signs to be used to designate various parking lots at Expo, these cute hippos and moose and rabbits and so on. In 1974, Modely continues to, in this article, sort of highlight Paul Arthur's work, showing his pictographics, which are trademarked by Paul Arthur and Associates, are sold in different sizes with commercial, medical, travel, recreational, and safety messages. So he was continuing to sort of promote the work of his friend in various venues. Here we see Paul Arthur and some of his pictographics symbols. If you grew up in Canada in the 1970s or 1980s, you saw these swimming ones everywhere. Some more, here's a 1968 cover story from Canadian Hospital magazine showcasing Paul Arthur's work for Sunnybrook Hospital in Toronto, both pictographs and wayfinding. So Arthur's kind of quietly effective and often witty work. Here's some work travel centers he did in Oregon in the 1970s, and a proposal to continue these into California. And one of my favorite works by him, a personal invitation to a party at his house, a dinner party, showing maybe again that tension between symbols and the need to add specific verbal supplements. Arthur's work, it's humorous. Often it's quietly effective. It lacks some of the broader idealism that Modely and Mead would have in these years. Although he did share their frustration at disorganized, uncoordinated efforts resulting in poor signage. So somebody who was not shy about promoting themselves or their ideals was Charles K. Bliss, who's already been mentioned here, Czech chemical engineer who settled in Australia after the Second World War, and who earns a rare double-page spread here, right at the beginning of Symbol Sourcebook, alongside Isotype. And Suze talked about how this was already Modely's recommendation to Dreyfuss. But Bliss remained something of a marginal figure in these years, he was personally kind of flummoxed by what he saw as the lack of recognition of his system, or the public ignorance of his system. And other designers tended to recognize the complexity and the originality of his complete language system through these graphic symbols, but avoided him due to his extreme irascibility, obstinacy, and egotism. And this is totally on display in his voluminous correspondence and hundreds of self-authored newsletters. So Modely, who comes in for some harsh critique from Bliss, nonetheless included his work in this article, or this chapter of the GLYPHS book, Sign Image Symbol in '66, Graphic Symbols for Worldwide Communication. So here's just a sample letter from C.K. Bliss to the Australian Association for the United Nations. Once he hears about this GLYPHS project in 1964, it sends him into a furious rage, and he writes to everybody he can think of, including, as a kind of last ditch, the head of the Australian Association for the United Nations. And the bits I've underlined here, he talks about how for 22 years he and his wife have suffered all the labor and birth pangs for their idea of Bliss symbolics. We printed with our own hands and our own earnings the books which prove that I have solved the problem for all fields of human endeavor. Now the highest organization of all humanity, the United Nations, has taken up the problem of international symbols without knowing that I have solved the problem already. So, this is kind of absolutely characteristic of Bliss's correspondence. In 1972, he's writing about how Margaret Mead and Rudolph Modely have given me many sleepless nights and many harrowing days. And he's talking here about their article, Communication Among All People Everywhere, published in Natural History 4 years earlier. So for 4 years, he's been sort of stewing about this article, and then makes it the subject of a Bliss Symbolics newsletter. Right. So in this article, which is probably the fullest elaboration of their approach together, Modely and Mead outlined this goal. Again, quote, a set of clear, unambiguous signs that can be understood by the speakers of any language and by the members of any culture as a first requirement for our technologically developed world. And they focus on this experience of the jet traveler, right? The international traveler, which throws into high profile this problem, this disjunction in modern life between the ease of international travel and the unease faced by travelers attempting to navigate through airports and bus terminals and train stations, or to read signs in another language at their destination. And so for Mead and Modely, they make the link between this practical wayfinding and then the next leap, which is the possibility or potential held out by these visual symbols to remove obstacles to future coordination, cooperation, and world peace and universal harmony. But they're also practical. They recognize that such initiatives need to be supported by infrastructural and government frameworks. So they call here for coordinated research, development, and testing, broad private and public support for glyph development, a nationwide educational campaign as glyphs are introduced into any one country, and a permanent body of international and national experts to keep the international symbol system up to date. Modely somewhat later, or actually around the same time, is promoting this idea in a different document where he says, we need basically a central glyph office for the whole world and national glyph centers, which must have the authority and the ability to ensure nationwide acceptance once a glyph has been accepted for universal use. So there was certainly this kind of authoritarian bent here, the recognition that this was going to at some level have to involve not only a widespread plan of education, but also government action. So here at the bottom we see Modely and Mead reproducing 4 no smoking signs, none of which they say have much chance of winning the race for a simple and meaningful glyph for no smoking. So we have Bliss Symbolics, Expo 67, the International Air Transport Association, and International Committee for Breaking the Language Barrier, which Sue has already mentioned, so I'm not going to go into too much detail about Soichi Kato, except that he seems from my point of view, to be a difficult figure to get much information on. So if anybody has more information about the ICBLB or Cato, I'd be really interested in hearing it. So this is his article of 1967 in an issue of Print that's largely dedicated to Expo 67, where he outlines the results of a survey that he had sent to 500 designers and organizations in 1965. And this is likely where most people, it seems, had first heard of the ICBLB, is when they received this survey in the mail. Here again is that discussion that Dreyfuss and Moodley are having about him, which Sue highlighted for us. Complete phony, publicity hound, accomplishes nothing, how does he make his money, etc. You know, it's a bit snipey, these comments. But Cato, you know, as late as 1972, is addressing this international conference on highway sign symbology in Washington. And after this, the trail goes a little cold. I haven't been able to find much after this in terms of his actions, whether he disbanded the ICBLB or what. But back to GLYPHS. So what was their final role with the Symbol Sourcebook as it took place in the late 1960s? Again, Sue has already shown this suggestion over lunch by Moodley that perhaps GLYPHS should take over the organization of the symbol dictionary. I made no comment. Throughout this period, throughout the last years of the 1960s, you know, Moodley and Mead they're interested in the idea of the symbol dictionary, and they want to support Dreyfuss in this, but they're also even more interested in the idea of a data bank or a symbol archive. So they're in conversations with folks at NYU. Maybe it'll be housed in the new NYU library for a period of 5 years. They're talking to Mildred Constantine at the MoMA. Does the MoMA have room for this? And so ultimately there's this sort of push-pull as they're trying to figure out which or both of these projects to kind of do at once. Well, they're also consulting with Dreyfuss on the Symbol Sourcebook. And so here's results of a lunch meeting where Mead and Mildred Constantine meet with Henry Dreyfuss in 1968. And Dreyfuss writes that Mead urges that the dictionary adhere to the principles of all language dictionaries to collect symbols which are currently used and categorize them, but avoid trying to be innovative. Archaic meanings and derivations might well be part of the dictionary. She feels that no testing should be involved. Rather than research, she would use the expression to compile information and edit as being the purpose of the dictionary. So some interesting sort of influence of Mead here on the final shape of the Symbol Sourcebook, and as well in this study that GLYPHS proposed to classify the symbols. They undertook the work of thinking about how these symbols should be classified. For them, this was the key question in the Symbol Sourcebook. And I've highlighted this point here where Moodley and Mead say the arrangement of the symbols in the main body of the dictionary should be based on a graphic classification system. So this idea of graphic form versus Dreyfuss at this point was really wedded to the idea of presenting symbols in terms of meaning. So that where Moodley and Mead were saying you need to have a section where you have all forms of crosses that share this basic graphic orientation. Dreyfuss was saying, well, no, I think the Christian cross should go with religious symbols, and the Red Cross should go with first aid symbols. And so this seems to have been that recognition and the acknowledgments that Mead, he attributes it to Mead, not Moodley, originally came up with. So in 1972, of course, the Symbol Sourcebook comes out, and in an article published 2 years after Dreyfuss's death, Moodley writes in this article, World Language Without Words, which I should say is also the name of a forthcoming book, supposed to be coming out in a couple of weeks, by Günther Sadner at the Universität Wien, called Weltsprache ohne Wörter, so using this phrase, and it's about GLYPHS and Moodley, and Sadner has helped me a bit with some of the research for this, so I want to thank him. In this article, Moodley again, he stresses the need for organized authoritative oversight into symbol development, testing, education, and implementation. And here, just to close, he inserts a note about the Symbol Sourcebook. Industrial designer Henry Dreyfuss has published a Symbol Sourcebook, which contains several thousand graphic symbols, many intended for public use, many for limited professional use. This collection, amassed over a period of many years from many diverse sources, is of great value to students. It is also a convincing demonstration of how drastically most of the public symbols fail to conform to the objectives we have established. We may pick almost any one of the public symbols in Dreyfuss's book, and we find that it is not unique, it is not independent of language and culture, it does not convey its message directly by its visual form. This, of course, is not an indictment of Dreyfuss's work, but an indictment of the symbols which have been flooding the world without proper planning, proper coordination, and proper education. Moodley in 1976, he dies in September 1976. This is published a couple of months afterwards. It's hard to see how this advances his aims. It's a bit of a disappointing coda in a way to Moodley's illustrious career. It reprints essentially his 1942 Pictographic book alongside symbols from the IGA Department of Transportation study in 1974. So you get these sort of Arndt's-like isotype figures sitting somewhat uncomfortably alongside the more international style modernist ones. But I am happy to see that Arthur's or Burton Kramer's animals made it in there after all. All right, that's it for me.